When you drink a bottle of wine, you probably don't give much thought to what happens to the bottle when you're finished with it. If you're a responsible Oregonian, you probably put your bottle into a glass recycling container, and that's that. But while recycling glass is great instead of throwing it into the landfill, it's still far from ideal, as it takes a lot of energy and resources to crush the glass, melt it, and turn it into a new bottle. And that's where Revino comes in. Revino partners with wineries to provide glass bottles that are specifically designed to be washed and reused up to 50 times. Revino and its founders have received numerous awards, including a recent award by Sedcor, for their innovative and industry-transforming approach. In this episode, one of Revino's founders, Keenan O'Hern, is joining me to discuss what Revino is, how it got started, how the process works, why this is more significant than most people realize, and how Revino is about to transform the wine and glass bottle industry nationwide. Hi, I'm Daniel Roberts, host of the Givingtown podcast, where we share stories about the people and organizations that make Newburgh so great. This podcast is brought to you by my real estate team, the Joyful Roberts Group, where we help your family make the right move. We love serving this town and our amazing clients and would be happy to assist you with buying or selling a home anywhere around the greater Newburgh area. If you're interested, you can learn more about us at thejoyfulrobertsgroup.com. Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Keenan about Revino. Keenan, thanks for joining me today on the Givingtown podcast. It's nice to finally get together, and we probably chatted a bit too much before we got on, but I'm excited to share with our listeners today about Revino and about really, there's not many things that I feel comfortable calling revolutionary. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think what you guys are doing with Revino is actually revolutionary, and I'm it's fun to be kind of along on the ride with you guys and have you guys right here in town, what I think is going to have a national impact. So welcome.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Daniel. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to share and talk more about Revino. It's obviously something I'm passionate about.
Yes, yeah. So you guys focus on reusable wine bottles, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but there's kind of an interesting and I guess I would say a sad history of bottles, reusable versus disposable and how that came to be. So can you share a bit about how we got to where we are, and then we can kind of get to how we can maybe get back to some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't feign saying that I'm an expert on any of this, but just looking historically, you said it perfectly. I mean, there's this historic aspect to this. And if you think back to the bygone era of like the milkman, or when we could take Coke and Pepsi bottles that were strewn about on the street and return them for a deposit, and those would be then reused. And this is kind of this like culturally built system that had been in place, especially in the United States and around the world for centuries. I mean, if you look back even further, they used to actually hand down glass bottles as a part of an inheritance, right? There was so much value to that glass.
Wow.
And so when you look at that and you take that lens and you place it on today and where we're at, and there is no reuse in existence, right? All of that glass is what we call one-way glass or single life, where it's going direct from the manufacturer to the consumer to the landfill. So there's no recirculation of that.
So yeah, how did that happen? I mean, 100 years ago, everything was reused, and it seems so ironic that with how environmentally conscious we are, that we went from everything being reused to everything going to the landfill. So how'd that happen?
Yeah, I think there's a mix and probably a number of different factors that played into it. But if you start looking at like the 1970s, right, that was when Oregon placed the first bottle bill in the nation into policy. And what happened at that point was there was this new deposit bill in Oregon specifically, and there was a return value that was placed onto, these containers. At that same time, there was kind of this movement that was happening away from glass because it was a little bit bulkier, a little bit heavier, to more of that aluminum or PET route, right? So this is when kind of a lot of the breweries and beer companies were starting to shift in that direction. So what was happening was it was race to zero. Like, how do we slim the bottom line? Like, how do we save money for the company? What's a lighter, more cost-effective material? But then in the back end of that, what was the externality of it Well, we started focusing on not reducing, not reusing, but recycling. So when you think about like the 3 arrows, the chasing arrows, which we all grew up with, right, in elementary school, middle school, high school, there's this reduce, reuse, recycle. But it was always intended to go in that order. You first reduce, then you reuse, and then you recycle. But we went directly to the third, which was recycling, and we became a recycling nation, right? Like that was what we started to do. And yet the infrastructure was never set up to actually support recycling. And so why we kind of have maybe lapsed in our reuse capabilities since that bygone era of the milkman is because we started focusing in different aspects. And it was to, purely support this movement or this shift that happened in industry, which had more of an aluminum focus.
I've heard that the whole recycling thing was actually, and I don't know if this is true or not, or just, propaganda or whatever, yeah. or what's it called? This conspiracy. But that it was almost a propaganda campaign for some of these bottle companies to say, hey, if we get people to, recycle instead of reuse, we can make more. I don't know if there's truth to that or if you've looked into that.
Yeah, there's lots of really great resources and background to look into. What I'll say to that end is that there really was a limited, actual effort to build out the infrastructure needed to support a recycling system required for our country. And if you start looking at what happened to that recycled material, there was never really a real end result for it. If you look at glass now, there are decent percentages that are getting crushed and made into new bottles. And so those processes are starting and they're actually growing and growing and growing.
Which is good.
Which is great. Yeah. And we want to see more of that. And I think this starts to go, and we'll talk about this more, but to what does the actual ecosystem look like? I mean, we don't really see ourselves as a competitor to a MRF or a waste hauler. They're doing a much needed thing in the community, right? They're providing a service. We just think of ourselves as providing that upstream solution that's utilizing material before it goes to that end, result.
And I think we could talk about, I feel like that could probably be an entire podcast about the history of recycling and all of that. The main idea, though, is that even if you are recycling it, what percentage are we looking at of bottles that are sold that actually go to recycling? Yeah. Or what is that?
Yeah, so the EPA has a number. It's around 30% across the nation of actual glass that gets recycled. That's not anything specific to maybe a beverage container versus a pasta sauce, container.
Which means 70% is going into the landfill.
Exactly.
Which is
and that's the number to really focus on. Is that's a lot of not only waste that's going to the landfill, but material that actually does take a really long time to decompose. Glass is structurally very sound.
Yeah, which is why you reuse it.
Exactly, right? And so I think it's just kind of sometimes seeing the paradigm shift of, okay, recycling has been this thing that we've been taught. And it's actually a good practice, but how do we make sure that recycling actually works properly? Well, you have to limit the stream that's going to it so that when it gets to that recycling step, it's very easy to separate out the specific materials.
Yeah, and that's not even talking about the cost to recycle. You have to heat it up, melt it down. Right. And there's cost there. So given all that, where we are, we've gotten away from reusing, and especially in America, we're a very convenience driven culture. And I'm part of that too. Even though I try to do a good job of recycling, Amazon and the Fred Meyer pickup instead of actually going in the store. I can save an hour of time, which is crazy. Yeah. It takes that long going inside the store, but beside the point. So given where we are and, how did you go from recognizing, hey, this is what's going on to okay, I actually want to do something about this?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a catalyst moment, which was actually buying my first home. And as a young, just husband and also just a community member that was excited about Newburgh and this place that I was moving to and wanting to kind of steward a future for it for my future family. I just started looking at what was around me, right? What industries played a big role in this town, what industries played a big role in this area. what kind of externalities came from those, because I did look at it through a sustainability lens. I wanted to know what the impact was that not only me as a homeowner would be making, but how I was interacting with businesses around me and what they were doing, right? Like I was looking at that. I was reading their websites. I was understanding what their purpose statements were, right?
Yeah.
And when I started looking at that, I had this, perspective that comes from my background where my mom's from the Netherlands. And so I'd grown up overseas and between here and there. And over there, it was commonplace, right? Reuse was just a part of everyday culture. You'd drink Heineken one night and the next day you'd put it in crates and bring it back to the store. And those bottles would be reused and they'd have these worn halos around them. And that comes from just like the rubbing. And it was literally just a part of everyday human interaction with these containers or this commodity. And so for me, it felt like there's this very no-brainer solution. And when I started looking at wine here and the industry that it is and how big it plays, like of a role it plays in this community, I was kind of shocked and frustrated to find that there really wasn't a solution in place, right? Like maybe there was recycling happening, but to what extent? And so that was kind of the onus to start looking at this more in depth, right? Like how could a solution that I've seen in action in other places of the world play out here, and what would it take to implement that?
So with wine specifically, has this been done in other parts of the world?
Yeah. So for wine specifically, you can look to Austria, Germany, Italy even plays this out in much more like very closed loop, smaller scales. But Austria is a great example of this being played out on like a national scale. But within like reuse and glass reuse specifically, it's across all industrialized nations except the United States. And so when you're thinking about that, right, when you're thinking about like scope of...
It's kind of embarrassing.
And yeah, like there's this like, wow, we are significantly behind the curve. And it's not just like, because we used to be in the ballgame. Like we were playing, we were a member, we were doing that kind of reuse ecosystem thing, but we're the only country that really like let that fall to the wayside. Like we just stopped. We took down the infrastructure. Other countries reinvested in the infrastructure. They kept it going. They kept investing into reuse. And so there's just some catching up to do.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, why hasn't this been done before? I mean, given like even especially in the Northwest, I feel like we're very environmentally conscious. We're leaders in the region for wine. Like those two together would seem like this maybe would have already happened. So like when you did your research, has anyone tried this, or is it just like no one's even thought of it before?
No, there's been so many people that have come to the table looking to do this. And I think like we really are riding on the backs of a lot of those champions, because it took a lot of, initial policy work, laying down groundwork for what this could look like for the future to drive reuse language into bottle bills. And so that's been happening all before Revino even came to the scene. But there was an attempt down in California a few years ago, and I like to call it out because it was big effort. And what they did is they came to the table and they said, okay, we're going to collect any bottle in the wine industry and we're going to sort it out and wash it and then sell it back in like batches, right? But there's so many different types of bottles on the market, right? I mean, one, you've got your Burgundies and your Bordeaux shapes, and then you have to, in between those, there's different molds that different producers and manufacturers sell. And so now you're sorting out thousands of different types of bottles, which is just insanity. And so looking at that model and then looking at some of the models overseas that work really well, or even, just to our, just to the north of us, Canada, they standardized everything. So they said, okay, one beer bottle, that's the beer bottle we're going to use. And they have collection rates of close to 95%. And so it's really just simplifying things, right? Like, can we have a simplified, more uniform bottle that allows for a more uniform system? And so the answer is yes. There's been so many efforts in the past. It's just sometimes it's not been wrong time, wrong place, right? Others have just been focusing more on laying that groundwork so that it can actually work. And
can you tell me about like when you first came to the realization, like, okay, I'm actually going to jump in and do this. What was that like going from like, okay, I'm actually going to do this?
I think it was a lot of naivete. My original plan and scope for the project was to like get just a dishwasher and wash bottles and then bring them back to wineries. And I was going to do that in my backyard. And that quickly evolved. And as I learned more about the process and more about the impact that I could make with a scalable business, that I could actually earn revenue and reinvest that and generate, a bigger solution that would offer or cater to a larger area. Like I started seeing the scope and it was a lot bigger than what I initially intended. And so, I think there, like I said, healthy amount of naivete, which gets you like off the ground and, having some like youthful vigor to just keep pursuing, and it's relentless. I mean, it's a lot of door knocking. It's a lot of asking questions. But what I did and what I'd seen done in industry before me was, working hand in hand with industry. Right. And so instead of me coming up with a solution just at home and thinking this is perfect, I'm going to sell this to a winery and they're all going to want to buy it, I went and worked harvests and I got my hands dirty and I learned from the producer what they were crafting and why it was important to them and kind of their ethos for life as a wine producer and how that was invoked in their wine and how they sold that wine. Like there was this story that was being told from their terroir to how they farmed that land to then how they then produced it and made that wine. And I really wanted to cater to that, right? I wanted to build and create something that they would be excited about, that when coming to the table, they would want to share as well. And it be a part of that story. Like it continued that story to the customer and that customer then got to experience it, but then also like had this new interaction that they got to play. And so that was always kind of integral in what I was thinking of doing. And so when we designed the bottle, because we actually designed a uniform reusable bottle that we introduced to the market, we brought 70 wineries to the table and we said, okay, just design, like, what do you think? And we would post, 3 different bottles and show like different designs and they go, well, we don't like that. We don't like this, but we love this. And so then we'd iterate and we'd come back to the table and go, what do you think about this? And, it took months of waiting and like just trying to get pieces of feedback, but those pieces of feedback were so important because they established what Revino is. So
what are some of those things that you found that maybe were either completely different from like what your initial assumptions were or just like, oh, maybe I hadn't thought of that before?
Yeah. I think, wine specifically is just steeped in tradition, right? It goes back, centuries if you're really looking at the history of it. And with that tradition comes, I think, a lot of like pride and a lot of expectancy of what this wine will convey or like what it means or what this bottle means and even the weight of the bottle, right? Like they're thinking about all of these little details that when I went into it originally, I just thought, okay, that's a bottle. It's a glass bottle. Like I know it should be reused. I'm thinking of it as a vessel, and I want to take that vessel and I want to wash it and bring it back to you. Whereas they were thinking about it as more than packaging. It was like literally this thing that is expressing wine. And it's the first interaction that a customer's having with their wine, right? Like they're looking at the glass and they're looking at the label. And those are the two pieces that drive a customer to make a purchase, right? Or to decide, I want to try that wine. And so there was a lot more to it that I don't think I saw when I was just looking at the surface of my very simple, like, okay, A needs to equal B, and all I need to do is wash a bottle. It was for them, no, this is truly this is a thing that is holding our wine that we've worked so hard on and we've blood, sweat, and tears put into it, right? Like it needed to be more than that.
So tell me a little bit about just the process. Like when someone's never heard of Revino, they don't know anything about the wine industry and bottles. Give a picture of like what's happening right now. And then if someone says, yeah, I want to use Revino for my bottles, like what does that process look like? And I guess within that, how the business works. Because ultimately, like you talked about scaling. So it's got to be on a broader scale. So just kind of talk about that whole process, a picture of like, okay, what does this actually look like? What is Revino doing?
Yeah. So I talked a little about the bottle, right? So we designed this bottle, and what we did with this bottle is we just added some characteristics to it. So you'll see, if you're looking for a Revino bottle, this kind of like wrapping leaf motif on the shoulder of it. And then on the base of the bottle, it says refillable on it. And then in the punt, which is that indentation in the bottom of a wine bottle, that actually was reduced, and you'll actually see the state of Oregon outlined with chasing arrows going around it. All of these things were like, they were characteristics that were added, but they were done so intentionally to cater to the Oregon wineries that we're working with, our partners, right? So this bottle gets sold to a partner producer, and we have 43 so far that have bottled in these Revino bottles with their wines, and those have been released. Some of them have. Some are being released in 2025. But how consumers are engaging so far is, most of the time, these are being poured on premise. So these are being poured in tasting rooms, or they're being sent out to club members that live in the area. And that's actually great. That's where we always thought and envisioned this would start, was in more of those like closed loop ecosystems, direct from producer to the customer, because it allows for the most return possibilities. And it's also driving the customer back to the tasting room, right? Once you've enjoyed that wine and now you have this bottle, you can take it back to your favorite winery or another participating winery. And now that's actual foot traffic in the door at that premise, or on premise, at that location, at that producer. And so if you're thinking about it, like, producer sold the bottle, they filled it with their wine, they've sold it to the customer has it. Customers enjoyed it now, and it kind of goes into this post-consumer space, right? Where either they're returning it to the winery, or they're looking at our return network. So if they go on our website, they can see all the real return locations across Oregon. Now that is ever expanding. We get new people on board every week, or a new location. Maybe it's a restaurant or a winery, or a bottle shop in the gorge, wherever it is, right? Like, they get added, and they become a collection, a return spot, a return depot. So that's ever expanding. But the goal of this is that a winery producer, say, could send their club shipment to somebody in Florida, right? And that person in Florida, if there's enough volume that's landing there, we can build out with like a third-party logistics provider, a collection spot, and get those bottles back. And the intent is for this to become more nationwide, while not viewing it as like a hub and spoke model where we just have one facility that's washing here in Oregon, but that we have multiple micro facilities across the nation doing this and servicing local areas. Yeah.
So for someone who is, like, just say, like, for a winery, normally they're getting their bottles just from any distributor.
Sure.
Now, is there anything special about the bottles that makes them like more reusable, or like, could these bottles be reusable, but there's just so many that you just can't, you can't have 1,000 different, like you mentioned, can't wash 1,000 bottles and sort them and all that. So
right.
I'm just curious about that part.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's cool if you look globally to see what else is being done, because in Germany, they use basically just the run-of-the-mill wine bottles or beer bottles, right? It's your kind of basic bottles, except they have lower weights than we do here. And they're getting 50 uses out of those bottles. Here in the United States, where we typically veer more on that heavier bottle weight-wise, because we think it's more of a premium feel or more of a premium packaging solution. So for us, what we did when we designed this bottle is we said, okay, Oregon does most things in Pinot Noir. That's the primary product that we make here, right? We manufacture. And 80% of that goes into what's called a Burgundy bottle. So what we did is our bottle is a Burgundy antique green wine bottle. And when we reduced that punt, we took that glass and we reinforced the base of it and reinforced the shoulders. So right where you would see more rubbing between bottles. And it's actually now engineered for more reuse. We want to ensure that we're getting upwards above 25 towards that 50 goal of uses, because after that second use, we've already broken even on carbon emissions, and now we're just saving. And so it would be great to get 50 uses out of every bottle.
So there's a huge part in just reusing the bottles. Obviously there's carbon emissions. There's, reducing landfill waste. What about from the economic side of what someone's paying? So like right now, someone's buying a bottle from a manufacturer. What does a normal wine bottle cost? Like if you're buying it in bulk as a winery?
Yeah. I mean, if you look domestic market wise, typically let's just average around $1 a bottle, right? So that would be $12 a case, 12 bottles per case. So when you're looking at that in just comparison to like what a reuse ecosystem can provide, the reuse ecosystem doesn't have those manufacturing costs associated each time, right? Like you're not taking new more material or having to mine material and then melt it down and then make the mold the bottle and then cool it down and then repack it, right? Like there's a much simpler process that's going in. So we have very low operating costs that are in relation to each individual bottle, like at a unit cost. And so for us, we can actually mitigate and manage cost year over year.
Right.
Whereas the manufacturing industry side of glass has to obviously, ebb and flow as the market or as, imports, exports. There's a lot of other factors that come into play.
Right.
So yes, on the economic side, there's a lot more of a balance and equilibrium that's found in terms of like planning for future glass purchases.
So what does that look like so like a normal bottle costs $1. What does Revino's bottle cost initially?
Yeah, so we're actually right at that domestic cost. So we're right at $1 as well. So that's like if you're purchasing a new Revino bottle, $1 per bottle, boom. Okay. And then, but the next year after that, so say we've sold that bottle to a producer and they got that bottle back, we offer a 10-cent basically incentive towards that and says, okay, you've returned that bottle to us. Thank you so much. We really needed that. We're going to take 10 cents off of that next year purchase because of that bottle you brought back to us. And so that helps the producer know that they're bringing their costs down by obviously sharing more about this ecosystem and why it's important for customers to interact with it, while also securing on our side more supply.
Yeah. So on a, like for a typical winery, I know there's really no typical winery because people are, there's huge ranges, but, if you just think of like the typical winery that you can think of, like maybe the median amount, like how many bottles, how many cases are people going through as a winery?
Yeah.
Like how much of an impact are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's interesting because, like you said, there's such a variance. It's like Oregon, especially, right? We actually have a lot of like really small wineries all the way to a few much larger ones. So if you average out usually about like 1,000 cases at that like smaller to medium sized winery level, or more, depending, out of maybe 1,000, let's say, our goal in the first year would be to get back roughly 500.
500 cases?
500 like bottles.
Oh, 500 bottles.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So we're looking at, a much smaller percentage of that, somewhere in between 5 to 7%. And that's really reflective of what we've seen other kind of ecosystems start with. They start with around 5 to 7% return rate. And then each year it grows incrementally. Okay. And we're already though seeing around 15% at select locations. So there's a lot of interaction that's happening with customers.
And a huge part of that is a culture shift, right? Like you mentioned in the Netherlands, it's just what you do. Yeah. Whereas here, quote, what you do is you either throw it in the garbage or or hopefully you're recycling it. But if you have glass recycling, but it's a matter of shifting the culture. Like, hey, who was it? I think Seth Godin talked about marketing, and it's basically the idea in culture, which is what you're trying to do, is basically people like us do things like this. Yeah. So like, hey, if we're Oregon wine drinkers, we return our bottles. Like, if we live in the Netherlands, we're returning. Like that's just what you do. And there's another quote that I think it was culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it's really a matter of like, even if there's a benefit economically and all these things, like people need like this new habit formation of like how do we do that? Because I think on the one hand it could be tempting to be discouraged by, gosh, like we're making all these effort into reusable bottles and so many people are just throwing them away, like that could be depressing.
Yeah.
But if it's like, no, like we're at the start of something. So how do you maintain a hopeful perspective like that, right? Like, okay, my gosh, like 90% of our bottles are going to landfill, like, but you know, there's hope that it could be better moving forward.
Yeah. I think for us, it's knowing and understanding that this isn't something that just changes overnight, right? And each bottle that we have that gets sold and is put on a shelf, that's another bottle that now is saying reusable, refillable on it, right? Mm-hmm. So that alone is already sharing the case for reuse to just like the overall culture. But I think that's been, something that we've really had to share more bluntly is the fact that, it takes time. Like we don't have expectations for ourselves to overnight become the reuse giant that's now servicing every state in the United States and, has made this perfect system. That's not going to happen. This will take 10 years, a decade to really develop and grow. But at the same time, if we don't start educating people on reuse, we don't also point out other ways to reuse materials, not just glass wine bottles or beer bottles, but also like reusable cups, right? I mean, at home, we have glassware that we drink from every single night and we wash and then we reuse the next day. It's like taking those I call them stupidly simple or no-brainer solutions, like things that we're already doing and just implementing in how we interact with everyday life. If we're going to a coffee shop, let's bring a mug of our own that we're not using just a single-use, cup from the coffee shop. So it's really kind of being a part of this entire conversation and hopefully championing it in a way that shares it to the general populace. But at the same time, there is this like almost like catching up factor to it, right? Like I think we sometimes can be a little curt in saying, this is happening. It's a proven solution. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're just taking a tried and true thing and we're implementing it here. And we want you to participate with us. Yeah. And people get excited about it. Yeah.
So you mentioned this year you had 43.
Yeah.
And there's quite a big market, right? Because there's like 1,000 wineries and just here in the Willamette Valley. So what are some of the challenges you've seen in gaining adoption? What have you found that like actually works in, or like what have you found like the people who are taking or takers like, hey, yeah, we want to do this. Like, what have you found the common denominator there?
Yeah, I think the common denominator in those that are participating is that this has always been a part of their ethos. It's always been something, maybe if it's even been a solution that they've thought of pursuing themselves. Like, hey, I thought about glass washing when I was so-and-so age, right? Like there's been this kind of commonality that we've seen with people that have partnered, to where they just know it's something that needs to be done, or maybe they've seen it themselves. So that's been nice because they're those first movers. They're the ones that are going to come to the table and they're truly just innovators. They want to participate because they know it's necessary. The thing that's been tough, and I think it's just really the newness of it in this space or in this country more specifically, is like there's just trepidation, right? Like there's unknowns. Can I trust the glass that's been washed? Is it clean enough, right? Like there's a lot of those follow-on questions that come into place, and some of it's just waiting to see after that first year, after that initial introduction to the market, will this stick around? Is it a flash in the pan or is it a lasting solution? Yeah.
And with that, what does it look like when I didn't realize we never actually talked about when you get the bottles back.
Yeah.
And how do you get the bottles back? Again, like there's drop-off locations, but how do you actually get the bottles back to Revino?
Yeah.
And then what happens to the bottles to make sure they're actually clean?
Totally. So there's 3 collection streams that we've really identified for Revino. So there's that first collection stream, which is direct from the winery, right? Or direct from the tasting room. That's a very specific one. It's just to that producer partner that's actually pouring on site, whether that's an event or just in their tasting room. That's our cleanest stream as we see it, because we know that they're using our bottles. They put our bottles in distinct boxes. We route out with a van, collect those bottles, and bring it back to our location. So that's stream number 1. Stream number 2 is...
So you're kind of on the way to becoming a logistics company
In a way, yeah. And it's not what we want to do, but in that specific stream, it's hyper necessary, and even falls into like more of that white glove approach where we like to be hands-on because we're partnering with these producers. We want to help them, and even have more face time with them. Stream 2 is a little more hands-off. So this is where it goes out to more of that HoReCa market, which is your
hotels. What market?
HoReCa. So it's your hotels, restaurants, your maybe like smaller boutique shops, things like that.
I've never heard that before. Is that an acronym?
It is an acronym.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, so when you look at that market, it's more of an organized effort, right? Okay. So you've got distributors that are maybe bringing full wines to these retail locations to then be sold. But if you're looking at those distributors, usually they have a truck that they're emptying, and now they have an empty truck. Well, can they put some of our Revino bottles in that empty truck and bring it back to a centralized location? Well, yes, they can. And they want to do that, right? And so what we found in that stream was that there was partners. There was either third-party logistics partners or there was distributors that wanted to collect this back. One, because it promoted their sustainability efforts, but then two, there was, an incentive to bring that back because they had an empty truck, and why not fill it? So that's stream number 2. And then stream number 3 is something that we work heavily on, which is really the build out and promotion of this at more of a statewide level, right? So when you think about the bottle bill, historically in Oregon, you've got beer, you've got PET bottles, you've got aluminum cans. What does it look like for wine to be included in something like that potentially? So working more in policy, working to maybe establish this as part of an ecosystem at the statewide deposit system level, and then not only in Oregon, but across multiple states. So that's stream number 3. Yeah.
And that would become, you talked about standardization earlier. So if a bottle was reusable and recyclable, instead of going in with the rest of the bottles that are being crushed, it would then be set aside and then brought back. Is that kind of what you're saying? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the idea with that is that because these bottles are characteristically different, they're able to be identified on maybe more of a mass sorting line, and then picked off and put aside so that reuse can happen. Mm-hmm. Whereas some of the other materials are just going to recycling providers. And so this is already happening in Oregon. If you look at, there's a beer reusable system, beer refillable system that OBRC championed over the last 5+ years. And the same thing, they made a identifiable bottle, had characteristics to it. It says returnable on it. And because it says that, consumers can bring it back and then they're able to pick it off their line. So that's the idea and the evolution of this going forward. And so a lot of what we've been doing is just building groundwork for what that can look like and being a part of those conversations. But stream 1 and stream 2 we're already collecting back from. So.
Okay. What does that look like as you guys expand? Like, what are your goals for expansion? Like, what does this look like moving forward? Yeah,
I think the natural expansion is, one, obviously to other major wine regions across the United States, right? So you've got your Washington right to our north, and you've got California to our south, California making up the majority of the market. But then also, too, you got New York on the East Coast, and Texas is kind of this burgeoning new spot. So you've got the wine regions with fairly good populous areas that are doing a lot of the consumption right next to them. So that helps with easy access to a lot of downstream bottles or post-consumer bottles. But there's also the states with bottle bills already existing, right? And so those are really good locations that are already primed, that have figured out a lot of this collection network back that we can go into, and we can hopefully help write policy to include reuse in, or even to just maybe be the first to start championing that for them, to start helping them set that up for the future.
So what are your goals as far as, like, 43 this year? Like, how do you see yourself growing?
Yeah, I think for us, it's always been, well, how do we start with the wine industry, just because it's in our backyard, mm-hmm. and it's, something that we've interacted with a lot. But glass is glass, right? Like there's glass beer bottles, there's glass kombucha bottles, there's glass even water bottles, right? And all of these things can be reused. And so we hope in the future that we can really be a solution provider across different verticals in the beverage industry. And actually seen a lot of spirit brands come in because they're paying $3, $4, $5 per bottle for just the glass itself. Well, it'd be great if we could wash that for a much cheaper cost and give it back to them. So there's ways that our equipment and what we can do can actually service a greater part of the beverage industry just by being a wash provider, which is something that the United States has been missing for a long time.
So what about like specifically for you guys? Like, okay, you're at 43.
Oh, right? Yeah.
So how do you see yourself specifically growing?
Absolutely.
Looking for a number year.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have gone through that, like, okay, where do we want to be like a year from now, 2 years?
Yeah. I think for us,
there's a huge, I mean, I'm just thinking like there's 1,000, like even just starting with wine before like the other stuff, like, that'll take time to implement and get into. But the way I see it, there's 1,000 wineries here. You've got a wine bottle that works. Like, why not like at least get to like 80% of that? I would think. Like, how long is that going to take to get there? And how do you see yourself fulfilling that need over the next few years?
Yeah, the beauty of this, and we don't use this as a crutch, more of just like an amplifier, is that a lot of these metrics and maybe goal setting has been done through the representation of this in other countries, right? If you look to Austria, right, they're getting 90% return rates. If you look to Canada or Mexico, they're, usually in that 90 to 80% range. So that's a pretty decent number. Like, in the next decade, we'd want to be growing towards that, if not hitting that. But we also, if you look across Europe, and something that's been happening more at a macro level, is there's mandates that are going into place, right? So reuse is actually becoming something that, just like recycling is now mandated to happen. And the recent one is by 2030, 30% of all beverage containers that are in glass has to be in reusable containers. So, and that's across the European Union. So that's like a really big number, but that's going to invoke a pretty big explosion in the reuse space and infrastructure that's going to need to be built to support that. So our hope in the next, 20 years is that we can not only build the infrastructure that supports a reuse ecosystem that can service the whole country, but then also too, that we're actually writing this into policy, that this is becoming a part of law and how we actually manage our waste here in the United States, just like we did with recycling.
Yeah. What about from a manufacturing capacity? Like, how many bottles did you manufacture this year? How do you see that changing?
Absolutely. It goes much bigger. This being our proof of concept year, we did 700,000 bottles.
You say that again?
700,000 bottles.
So you made 700,000
reusable bottles. Yeah.
So 43 wineries did 700,000.
So,
oh wow,
43 wineries have done just about 50% of that.
Okay.
And so we started in April selling these. So our goal is to sell through all of that by next April, which we will. So that was kind of like the first, get this batch out, just get it into what we call like the glass stream.
That seems like a huge number for your first year. I don't know if that's just me. It seems like for tapping like 1% of what's possible.
It's actually quite small if you look at the industry. And that's why we kind of chose it, because it was just enough to make a big enough dent to say, hello, we're here. And bottles would be on shelves at like a New Seasons or even Whole Foods or some other kind of location, but also just scratching the surface. I mean, if you look at 1,000 wineries in Oregon, right, that's just over 60 million bottles, give or take. It's probably more now. 700,000 is just a small dip.
Wait, say that again. How many did you say are?
There's about 60 million a year that are produced here.
60 million. Yeah. Wow, that is crazy.
Yeah. So, and that number's just been going up, right? And then if you look to California, that you're starting to look at, hundreds of millions into the billions. And so there's a lot more volume that's happening, in those spaces. Even Washington does more volume than we do in Oregon. So,
and really there's kind of this, the way my brain sees it, like a curve going from, like, as you expand, the number of bottles you're producing is going to go up, but hopefully it continues to go up at a slower rate as you're able to reuse more of these, right?
Yeah.
But obviously, if there's only 10% being returned at first, like 90% of that new growth is going to have to come from new manufacturing.
Yeah.
So how do you see yourself growing? Like, 700 this year, like, have you projected out like, hey, where do we want to hit like number wise?
Yeah. It evolves every year. I think we want to be in that 2 million kind of range in this next year. So more than doubling. And that looks likely. But it's fascinating because we've mostly worked with smaller to medium-sized wineries, a couple large ones like Willamette Valley Vineyards, but there's some of these medium to larger sized wineries that could basically replicate our entire first year just in one order. And that would be from one winery instead of a combination of 43, right? So it's so variable because one player can actually do quite a bit of production, and that would change our numbers drastically. So
it's got to be exciting too. I mean, in your first year, because how long have you been working on this?
Initial idea was about 5 years ago. Okay. But actual like on the ground implementation, working on this full time about 2.5 years now. So
it's got to feel good to have your first it's actually working.
Yeah,
right?
like it is amazing to see people interacting with these bottles. Willamette Valley Vineyards recently told us that they're starting to see that 15% return just back into their own tasting rooms from the wine that they've already released in Revino bottles. And so they're really encouraging numbers. Some of them are way beyond what we anticipated in the first year. And I mean, I always thought like, I'll start with 20 wineries and I'll do, a pretty small batch of bottles, and it doubled, and so these are all things you want to see. But at the same time, if we want this to continue growing, to bring in the revenue that we want to see to make a bigger impact, we need more people to use reusable bottles.
Yeah. So several months ago, you talked at the Chamber of Commerce, maybe a few months ago, whatever it was. Yeah. And I don't remember if it had to do with your washing. I just was thinking about this. If it was your washing machine, like your what do you call it? That's not a washing machine, but it's the machine that washes the bottles. Yeah. You get what I'm saying. Sanitation. Yeah. But I thought you mentioned like you were the first in the world to have done like some particular thing. What was that again? Yeah.
Well, surprisingly, when we went through the process of designing this bottle and designing it specifically for like reuse or refill, we didn't realize that we were the first, to our knowledge, around the globe that had actually done that for a wine bottle, that had actually made a wine bottle that was specific for reuse.
So you said they do it in Europe, but they don't
use, whatever bottle is the most used and the most uniform, which, to be honest, and where we always hoped this would go, is that somehow the industry here in the United States could unify around a couple different shapes, and they can say, all right, we're going to do all of Pinot Noir in this one bottle, and that's the only bottle we'll use, because that's perfect for us, right? Mm-hmm. That takes it off of us to then, introduce this reusable bottle, and it just basically says, great, now all the glass we're using has the potential to be reused instantly. Yeah. By using just a single type of bottle. But there's a lot of players, and that is unlikely to happen soon. But in other countries, it's been done, and that's been the benefit. Yeah.
But you guys are the first to specifically make a bottle for reusability. Yeah. Okay, well, that's gotta feel good.
Yeah. And it's cool, and like there's other people now jumping on board and doing it in Europe, and so obviously the word is spreading, and that's great. And what it was nice with us though is that we were able to really kind of like engage with that narrative and control it a little bit and how it was shared to the people that were participating, both on the producer side and on the consumer side. So,
are you getting involved with policy, like at the legislature standpoint of and how's that been going?
Yeah, I mean, we've testified a couple times just in front of legislator just to share what we're doing, to express why we're doing it and the impact that we see in the community, not only today, but what we believe will be the impact in the future. And so that's been going really well. It's received really well. I think the beauty of this solution is that it goes across the aisle. It's not something that one side seems to champion over the other. Both sides have been just extremely passionate and excited about it. And I think it's because it's just a no-brainer. It's we should probably be doing that, right?
Well, and I mean, this is going into the manufacturing side. As I was doing some research, there's 50, if I have my numbers right, 50 billion tons of sand used per year for glass. So glass comes from sand. Yes. But not all sand is usable for glass.
Right.
It has to be silicon dioxide,
Yeah.
I think, if I have that right. And we're actually, 50 billion tons is an unfathomable
It's huge.
number.
Yeah.
And it's actually starting to cause problems. So as grass production increases, because it seems, it's reusable, but if you're still having to take at least 70% of that, even at 30% return, this is going to be, it's going to take a huge effort globally to say maybe we should stop, destroying the environment. And some people who are less environmentally conscious, they like to say, oh, you guys are making a big deal. There's there's enough. It's not going to be an issue. But beyond global warming, there's very localized, in the river that you're digging in, if you're taking out billions of tons of sand, if you imagine in the Willamette, if you're just scooping out billions of tons of sand, it just causes problems.
Yeah, that river would look very different.
Yeah. Right. In some places, rivers are starting to flow backwards. It's causing flooding. It's causing ocean water to mess up, agricultural land. And this is okay, that's Southeast Asia, it doesn't affect us. It's about to. Even if it's not affecting you right now, it's affecting those people, which matters.
Yeah.
But even if that doesn't bother you, which it should, there's the whole infrastructure is going to, I think we're starting to see some real problems, and there's going to be a change that has to come. Right. So I guess that gives you guys hope, and I'm sure you're in all of this, right? You've got all this research, and so talk a little bit about that. Eventually we can't just take all the sand that's the usable glass sand in the world. Somewhere this has to stop. We have to really start enforcing and build that culture again around reusability. So what does that look like?
Well, yeah. And I think one just general statement, there's always going to be a relative amount of indifference and just unknowns that we as a society, we just don't have all the information, right? Or we might not be reading where those sources of information are coming from. But one of the things that was very early on shocking to me was this article came out and it was talking about sand theft, how entire islands would actually be disappearing off the face of the planet because they were mining this sand, right?
Oh, wow.
Because like you said, there's a specific material that they're looking for within the sand, which is that silicon material. But so that alone is very alarming, right?
It's like cartoon supervillain, this island disappeared.
Literally taking an island off the face of the planet. But I think it also invokes just this really raw response and emotionally, right? And if you look out to the Dundee or just the beautiful hills that literally come around us, right, that we make this wine on, or like you were saying, the Willamette River, if that was to be taken away, right, if that was to be totally impacted by efforts to make this commodity, to make this glass bottle, then that would impact us. We would very viscerally we'd probably feel very angry about that. And the thing about glass, though, which is so profound to me, is it is infinitely reusable. And that's the beauty of it, right? It's literally just sand mixed with a couple other things, heated at a very high temperature and formed into whatever we want it to be formed into. And it's a monomer. So when you break it down, it can be made exactly into the same thing that it was.
It's a what? A
monomer. So instead of a polymer, it's a monomer. So it's when at the cellular molecular level, it breaks down into the same things that it was made of, versus plastic, which is a polymer, has multiple different chemical components to it. You actually have to break it down and then separate those things to then be made into a new thing. Glass, you could take a glass from your shelf, break it into a big pile, and then you could, take that and melt it back down and make it into a new bottle. So there's just this beautiful, very circular nature to glass already, which already makes it one of the best materials to use. But at the same time, there is this mining and this raw kind of material extraction that's happening, which is hugely impactful to the planet and the environment. And so what I like to share is that glass itself can be the least environmentally friendly packaging solution until you reuse it, and then it becomes the most environmentally packaged packaging solution on the market.
So now it's a matter of getting the word out, right?
Yeah.
So how can people who they're passionate about Revino, or they're listening and hearing about it for the first time, and they have their favorite winery here. How can someone help their winery get on board?
Yeah, I think it's just being an advocate, being a steward for it, sharing the fact that you'd like to see future wines in reusable bottles. That alone has spurred a lot of people, a lot of producers to give us a ring and ask us about even question it, right? Like, yeah. And wonder of what they could do. And so that is so helpful to us. Another thing, if you're at home and you have a dinner party and people are like, where'd you get this wine? And it's in a reusable bottle. That's a pretty good sign. So like support the producers that are already using these bottles, because that can already spread the word in a lot of really good ways. Or if you're using glass, talk about it. Talk about how glass can be reused and why shouldn't we do that with our beer and wine and soda and kombucha and all these other glass containers we have. Yeah,
it's a cool, obviously it's a really cool concept, and I have so many ideas, but maybe we can talk offline, because yeah. I just love the business development side. But I think it's in some ways it can feel really daunting, like, what difference does it make? There's so much waste, like blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Or you can say, all right, but where can we start? Mm-hmm. And I think for me, it's exciting as one, to even be able to be here and get the word out and share this with hundreds, hopefully thousands of people who can hear the message and spread it along to their friends and family and other wineries. But also like to be able to have a hand in saying like, I can help make a difference. And I think each person listening, each person who, has a bottle of wine, Revino, is like, hey, I'm at the epicenter of a revolution of going from hundreds of millions, if not, across the United States, will there be like billions of bottles?
Yes.
Are we talking billions of bottles?
We're talking billions of bottles.
Yeah. So we're talking about billions of bottles, and, here, we've got 700,000 that ultimately can grow into that, multi-million until, maybe ideally we like to kind of stop, but eventually you talk about 50 reuses, eventually these bottles are going to have to be broken down, but if we can keep those, in the ecosystem, then, there's a lot of good that can happen from that.
Oh, a tremendous amount of good. And I think that's just really the exciting part. And like you said, I think that we all want to play a part, and I think we all want to do the best we can, especially when it's hard today to discern, will this actually get recycled, or will it, just go to a landfill? So having a solution where it's proven, like, you give it back to us, we'll wash it, give it back to a producer, right? Like, this is going to happen, and it's cyclical. I just encourage people to participate in it and try it, because I think they'll be profoundly interested and want to keep working at it too with us.
Well, last question is, despite the challenges, despite all these things, I know you answered some of this already, but what gives you hope for the future moving forward?
I think all the encouragement we've received from the community, and it's like you too, just people that are really excited to share it, that think of it as not only a solution that they get to participate in, but was something that, they get to champion and get excited about and share with others. And so what I'm seeing as hopeful is the response that like society is actually providing to this. And we've had this spread across the nation and news outlets and people that reach out to us and that just want to share it. They're like, oh, we've been so excited to share something about reuse. And I think that really just means that there's going to be a lot more stories around reuse, not just glass, but reusable cups and bowls and whatever it is, right? And hopefully we can continue to be a light for a lot of that. And that's really simply just the goal, is just keep sharing it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, Keenan. Appreciate it. It's fun talking to you, and look forward to getting the message out there.
Appreciate it, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Giving Town podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend who you think might benefit from hearing it. While more and more people are continuing to hear about this podcast, I still need your help to spread the message about all the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next episode.